The rescue party dug through 6-foot drifts on January 15th, 1888, expecting to find frozen bodies. A German widow, 3 children under 10, no wood, no coal, a tar paper shanty 15 miles from help. The temperature had dropped to 40 degrees below zero, but when they pushed through the door, warm air hit their frostbitten faces like summer. The children were playing on the floor. The widow was cooking rye bread, and the massive whitewashed structure in the center of the room radiated heat so gentle that one rescuer knelt and touched the earthen floor. It was warm enough to sit on. She had burned nothing but twisted prairie grass, and a design every American settler said would fail. The rescue party found the first frozen body at 9 in the morning, a woman, Norwegian, still clutching buffalo chips in her blue-gray hands, 10 yards from her own front door. The blizzard had swallowed her whole, spun her around in white nothing until she wandered past her own cabin without knowing it. Her children survived. Their father had burned the family Bible and their mother's wedding chest to keep the iron stove going another 6 hours. By noon on January 15th, 1888, the men on horseback had checked 4 homesteads along the James River Valley in Turner County, Dakota Territory. 3 families had survived. 2 had not. The pattern was the same at every stop. Iron stoves gone cold, furniture burned, frostbitten fingers and toes on the living, frozen flesh on the dead. The temperature that morning was 27 degrees below zero. The riders turned their horses toward the last homestead on their list. A German-Russian widow, 3 children under 10. A tar paper shanty 15 miles from the nearest settlement. No husband, no English, no chance, they figured. What they expected to find was what they had found everywhere else. They saw no smoke rising from the chimney. That settled it, they thought. The widow and her children were dead. But when they dug through the 6-foot drift blocking the door and pushed inside, warm air hit their frostbitten faces like a summer afternoon. The children were playing on the floor. The widow was cooking rye bread, and the massive whitewashed clay structure in the center of the room radiated heat so gentle and constant that one of the rescuers knelt and placed his palm against the earthen floor. It was warm enough to sit on. The widow had not burned a single stick of wood, not a single lump of coal. For 3 days, through the deadliest blizzard in American history, she had kept her children alive with nothing but twisted prairie grass and a heating design every American settler on the plains had told her would never work. But 6 months earlier, in the summer of 1887, Anna Albrecht had arrived in Dakota Territory with $47, 3 children, and a dead husband buried in Nebraska soil. What she built in the weeks that followed would save her family when the cold came to kill them. The question is how she did it, and why no one believed her until the bodies started freezing. The wagon that carried Anna Albrecht into Freeman, South Dakota, in August of 1887 smelled of dust and grief and the particular exhaustion of people who have crossed an ocean to bury someone they love. Her husband, Jacob, had died of dysentery in Lincoln, Nebraska, 17 days before they reached Dakota Territory. 36 children and 1 adult had died of the same disease during the Mennonite migration that year. Jacob Albrecht was the 1 adult. He was 34 years old. He left behind a widow of 32, a daughter of 9 named Katerina, a son of 6 named Peter, and a daughter of 4 named Maria. Anna had sold everything Jacob owned that could be carried, his tools, his Sunday coat, his father's pocket watch, and added it to the coins they had sewn into her skirt for the crossing. The total came to $47, enough to file a homestead claim and buy minimal supplies. Not enough for what Dakota winters demanded. The good land near Freeman was taken. 10 years of Mennonite settlement had claimed every quarter section within reasonable distance of the church and the general store. The land agent, a thin man with spectacles who spoke no German, pointed Anna toward a claim in Turner County, 15 miles from the nearest Mennonite household. Treeless prairie. No timber within 40 miles except along the Missouri River. She filed the papers. $12 for 160 acres of grass and wind and nothing. $35 remained. The tar paper shanty that came with the claim measured 12 feet by 14 feet. It had a dirt floor, a single window of greased paper, and walls so thin Anna could see daylight through the gaps. The previous owner had abandoned it after one winter. He left behind a rusted cook stove with a cracked firebox, a wooden bucket, and a note scratched into the doorframe. God help whoever stays. Anna read it and said nothing. Her nearest neighbor lived 3/4 of a mile to the northwest. John Henderson, 45 years old, Iowa born. He had homesteaded the Dakota Prairie for 10 years and buried a daughter in the hard winter of 1880 to 1881. When he saw the German widow and her 3 children moving into the abandoned claim, he rode over to introduce himself. His eyes moved from the tar paper walls to the rusted stove, to the 3 small faces watching him from the doorway. "Ma'am," he said, "I don't know what you're planning, but you can't winter here. Not with that stove, not with those walls, not with no wood." Anna understood English poorly, but she understood his tone. She had heard it before. In Ukraine, when her grandmother chose to stay on the farm while others fled. In Lincoln, when the doctor said Jacob would not survive the night. "How much wood?" she asked. Her accent made the words thick. Henderson studied her. 8 cords minimum, 10 to be safe. I burn 12 most years. He gestured toward the horizon, where grass met sky in every direction. "Nearest timber's 40 miles. Cost you $3 to $5 a cord just for hauling, if you can find someone willing to make the trip. More likely $4 to $6. Anna did the arithmetic. 8 cords at $4, $32. She had 35. "And a stove," Henderson continued. "A proper one. That thing you've got won't hold heat. Cast iron from the hardware in Freeman, $18 to $25 depending on size. 32 plus 18, $50. She had 35. "Or coal," Henderson said. $12 to $15 a ton delivered by rail. You'll need 4 to 6 tons. $48 to $90. She had 35. The math was impossible. Every path to survival cost more than she possessed. Henderson watched her face as she calculated. He had seen that look before, on the faces of other greenhorns who came to the prairie with hope and left with nothing, or didn't leave at all. "Ma'am, I buried my little girl in 81. She was 7. The cold came through the walls, and there wasn't enough wood, and she went to sleep and didn't wake up." His voice was flat, but his hands trembled on his horse's reins. "I'm telling you this because I don't want to bury yours. The best thing you can do is sell this claim before winter. Go back to the settlements. Find a husband. This prairie kills people who aren't ready." Anna looked at her children. Katerina stood in the doorway, holding Maria's hand, watching the American man on the horse. Peter was behind them, coughing. He had been coughing since Lincoln. "Thank you," Anna said, "for telling me." Henderson waited for her to say more. When she didn't, he tipped his hat and turned his horse. At the edge of her claim, he looked back. "I hope you listen," he called. "I truly do." She didn't listen. That night, after the children slept on straw pallets in the corner of the shanty, Anna sat by the light of a tallow candle and counted her money again. $35. 3 children. No husband. No English. No wood within 40 miles. No coal she could afford. What she had was knowledge. Her grandmother's house in Molochna, in the Mennonite colony in Ukraine, had stayed warm through winters colder than Dakota's. 30 below. 40 below. Wind screaming off the steppe, and her grandmother had burned nothing but twisted straw. The memory surfaced like a fish breaking water, the massive whitewash stove in the center of the house, the way her grandmother lit one fire in the morning and one in the evening, the way the clay walls held the heat all night, the way the floor near the stove was warm enough to sleep on. Anna had helped build one of those stoves when she was 16. She had mixed the clay and the manure and the straw. She had formed the bricks and stacked them and plastered the walls. She had never built one alone. She looked at her hands in the candlelight. They were strong from farm labor, rough from the Atlantic crossing. They would have to be enough. Outside, the prairie wind pressed against the tar paper walls, finding every gap, every crack, every weakness. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled. Winter was coming, and Anna Albrecht had a plan that every American on the plains would tell her was madness. 3 weeks later, Anna stood in the half-built frame of a German-Russian house in Freeman and studied the footprint of what would become someone else's stove. She had walked 15 miles to reach the Mennonite settlement for Sunday services. Her feet were blistered. Her children had stayed behind with the Henderson family. Margaret Henderson, John's wife, had offered to watch them while Anna got supplies. It was charity disguised as trade, and Anna had accepted it because she had no choice. The house belonged to Heinrich Schrag, a Mennonite farmer who had emigrated from Ukraine 11 years earlier. His stove was half-built, the lower courses already laid, the outline of the firebox visible in the arrangement of the bricks. "You know this design?" Anna asked in German. Heinrich nodded. "My father built 7 of them in Molochna. We call it the Russian stove. The Americans call it a curiosity." "Does it work here, with the cold?" "Better than there." Heinrich knelt and traced the outline of the internal channels with his finger. "The secret is the path the smoke takes. See here? The fire burns in the firebox, hot, fast, maybe 20 minutes for a full load of straw. The smoke rises, but it cannot escape directly. It must travel through these channels first, back and forth, like a snake. By the time it reaches the chimney, the heat has moved into the clay." Anna remembered. Her grandmother had explained it the same way. "How long does the heat last?" 20 hours from one firing, 24 if you use mist instead of straw." Mist. The word brought back another memory. Manure mixed with straw, trampled by horses, cut into blocks and dried in the sun. It burned longer and hotter than anything else the prairie offered. "The Americans say clay cracks in the cold," Anna said. Heinrich laughed, though there was no humor in it. "The Americans say many things. Their iron stoves eat 8 cords of wood per winter and go cold 4 hours after the fire dies. They burn their furniture in January and call it survival." He stood and brushed clay dust from his knees. "My stove in Molochna is still standing. My grandfather built it in 1832. 55 years and not one crack." Anna stared at the half-built structure. The dimensions were larger than she remembered. 4 feet by 6 feet at the base, 5 feet tall when complete. The walls were thick, 8 to 12 inches of solid clay. "I need to build one," she said. "Alone." Heinrich's expression shifted. "You have help? A husband? Brothers?" "I have my hands." He was quiet for a long moment. "How much money?" $23 after the homestead filing. "The iron door and damper will cost you 8. The rest, the clay, the straw, the manure, you can get from the land." He looked at her with something that might have been respect or might have been pity. "It will take 3 weeks of work, maybe 4. Every day you spend building is a day you do not spend gathering fuel for winter. If the stove fails, if the clay is wrong, if the design is off, if the channels don't draw, you will have nothing." "I know. And the Americans will say they were right, that the German woman killed her children with her foreign superstition." Anna thought of Katerina's face in the doorway, Peter's cough, Maria's small hands. "Then I will not fail," she said. The Hendersons thought she had lost her mind. Anna returned from Freeman with a sack of lime, a bundle of scrap lumber for forms, and instructions she had scratched onto a piece of brown paper in German. No stove, no coal, no wood. Instead, she had traded away the last valuable thing she owned. Her grandmother's feather bed, carried across the Atlantic in a canvas sack, for an iron door and damper at the Freeman hardware store. That night, she and her children slept on straw pallets, shivering under thin blankets while September frost crept across the Dakota Prairie. "Mama," Katerina asked, "why did you give away grandmother's bed?" Anna pulled her daughter close. "Because grandmother gave me something worth more than feathers. She taught me how to stay warm." The next morning, Anna began digging clay from the creek bank a quarter-mile from the shanty. The soil was thick and red-brown, heavy with the moisture of late summer. She loaded it into the rusted wagon that came with the claim and hauled it back by hand, 1 load at a time. 8 loads the first day, 10 the second. Her shoulders screamed. Her palms cracked and bled, but by the end of the first week she had the clay she needed. The mixing came next. Clay, manure. John Henderson had given her as much as she could haul, glad to be rid of it. Straw from the prairie grass she cut with a borrowed scythe. She mixed them in proportions her hands remembered better than her mind. 2 parts clay, 1 part manure, 1/2 part straw. The mixture had to hold its shape when squeezed, but crack along clean lines when dried. The forms she built from the scrap lumber, 4 inches by 8 inches by 12 inches, the same dimensions her grandmother had used. She pressed the mixture into the forms, packed it tight, turned them out onto boards to dry in the autumn sun. 50 bricks the first day, 52 the second. Her goal was 800. Peter helped carry water from the creek. Katerina helped mix the clay, her small arms churning through the heavy paste until Anna told her to rest. Even Maria contributed, playing in the mud and forming what she called little bricks that Anna praised and quietly discarded. The work was brutal and necessary and utterly alone. On the 4th day, Margaret Henderson rode over with a basket of food and a face full of concern. She stood at the edge of the brick-drying field, rows and rows of clay rectangles baking in the sun, and said nothing for a long time. Then, "Anna, what are you doing?" Anna wiped her hands on her apron. Her German-accented English came slowly. "Building stove." "A clay stove?" "Yes." Margaret stepped closer, studying the bricks. "My husband says clay cracks in the cold. When the temperature drops fast, like it does here, the clay expands and contracts. It'll shatter." "Not this clay. Not if built right." "How do you know?" Anna picked up one of the dried bricks. It was solid, dense, heavier than it looked. "My grandmother's stove, still standing, 55 years. Your grandmother didn't live in Dakota? She lived in Ukraine, colder than here. Same wind." Margaret crossed her arms. "And if you're wrong, what happens when this contraption of yours fails in January and you've got no wood, no coal, nothing but a pile of broken clay?" It was the question Anna asked herself every night. The question that woke her at 3 in the morning, heart pounding, children breathing softly in the cold darkness. "Then we die," she said simply. "Same as if I do nothing." Margaret opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. She looked at the bricks, at the shanty, at the 3 children watching from the doorway. Her face softened, though her worry remained. "I think you're crazy," she said, "but I brought bread and salted pork. Call it payment for helping with harvest last week." Anna had helped with the Henderson harvest for 1 day. The food Margaret brought was worth a week's wages. They both knew it was charity, but neither said so. "Thank you," Anna said. Margaret handed over the basket. "If that thing doesn't work, you bring those children to our barn. You hear me? Don't let pride freeze them." After she left, Anna stood among the drying bricks and allowed herself one moment of doubt. 800 bricks, 3 weeks of work. An entire winter balanced on the memory of a stove she had helped build once, 16 years ago. Then she picked up her forms and went back to mixing. Deputy Land Agent Charles Whitmore arrived on the 23rd of October when the stove was half built. Anna was on her knees in the center of the shanty, laying the 4th course of bricks around the firebox when the shadow of a man fell across the doorway. She looked up to see a narrow face, spectacles, and the expression of someone who has already made up his mind. Mrs. Albrecht. He pronounced it wrong, flattening the sounds into something American. "I'm conducting improvement inspections for the General Land Office. Mind if I look around?" It was not a question. Anna stood and stepped back, clay dust coating her hands and apron. Whitmore moved through the shanty with the efficiency of a man who had seen 100 failing homesteads. His eyes cataloged everything: the tar paper walls, the dirt floor, the rusted cook stove she had pushed into the corner, the half-built structure of clay bricks rising in the center of the room. "No wood stockpile," he said, writing in a small notebook. "No. No coal. No. No proper heating apparatus. Just this." He gestured at the stove. What is this? A stove. Russian design. Whitmore stared at it. The firebox was taking shape, lined with the hardest fired bricks. The first channels of the internal maze were visible, waiting for the upper courses. It looked like nothing he had ever seen in America. Mrs. Albrecht, the Homestead Act requires you to make improvements to your claim. Improvements. A proper house. A proper means of survival. He tapped his notebook with his pencil. What I see here is a tar paper shanty with a dirt floor and a mud oven. This isn't an improvement. It's what savages build. Anna's English failed her. She wanted to explain about thermal mass, about the channels that extracted heat from smoke, about the centuries of refinement that made this design superior to any iron stove. What came out was, this stove, bigger, hold heat. Whitmore smiled the smile of a man who has heard every excuse. Ma'am, I've seen 100 greenhorns think they know better than the land. Germans, Russians, Swedes. They all come here with their foreign ideas and their foreign ways. And the land always wins. He finished writing and closed his notebook. I'm making a note in my file. Improvements inadequate. Survival doubtful. If you're not here come spring, I'll know I was right. He left without saying goodbye. Anna stood in the doorway and watched him ride away. Her hands were shaking, though whether from anger or fear she could not tell. The note in his file was not just an insult. It was a threat. If Whitmore decided her improvements were inadequate, he could challenge her claim. Everything she had worked for. The filing fee, the weeks of labor, the grandmother's featherbed traded for iron, would be worthless. And if she failed, if she and her children froze in this shanty with its foreign stove, Whitmore would use her death to prove his point about immigrants and their foolish ideas. The wind picked up, carrying the first true bite of autumn cold. 35 days until winter. The setback came on the 20th of October. Anna woke to the sound of rain on tar paper. Hard, driving rain that had moved in overnight and showed no sign of stopping. She pulled on her shawl and stepped outside to check the drying bricks. 40 of them had softened in the downpour, their edges crumbling, their surfaces pocked and ruined. A full day's work dissolved. She stood in the rain, watching brown water pool around the ruined bricks, and felt something crack inside her. Not despair, exactly, something colder, the recognition that the margin between survival and death had just grown thinner. 40 bricks, 3 days to remake them, 3 days she did not have. Peter was worse that week. His cough had deepened into something wet and rattling, and Anna spent 2 nights sitting up with him, heating water on the rusted cook stove to make steam he could breathe. 2 days of brick-making lost to nursing. The stove was 60% complete. November 1st was 11 days away. If the first hard freeze came before the stove was finished, before it had time to cure, the whole structure might crack when she fired it. The neighbors watched. Anna knew they watched. She saw Henderson on his horse at the edge of his property, looking toward her claim. She saw the tracks of other riders who had come close enough to see the strange clay structure rising in her shanty, then turned back without introducing themselves. Word was spreading along the prairie telegraph. The German widow was building a mud oven. She had no wood, no coal, no proper stove. She had 3 children and $35 and a foreign design that every American farmer knew would fail. Some of them, Anna learned later, had placed bets on how long before she abandoned the claim. On November 2nd, the damper wouldn't seat properly. Anna had built the upper courses according to her memory, but somewhere she had made an error. The opening for the damper was a 1/4 inch too narrow on one side. The iron plate would not close flush. Smoke would leak. Heat would escape. She spent an entire day with a broken knife, scraping clay from the opening, testing the damper, scraping more clay, testing again. Her fingernails split. Her hands were raw and bleeding by the time the damper finally seated. That night, the temperature dropped to 18 degrees. Ice formed on the water bucket inside the shanty. The children woke with frost on their blankets. The stove was 85% complete. But it could not be fired yet. Russian stoves needed time to cure. 4 to 6 weeks in summer, 2 weeks minimum in cold weather. If she fired it too soon, the heat would expand the damp clay unevenly. Cracks would form, the structure would fail. She had no choice but to wait. On November 5th, Margaret Henderson arrived with a wool blanket, 2 pounds of salt pork, and a sack of potatoes. "Payment," she said, not meeting Anna's eyes. "For helping with the harvest." Anna's pride rose up, but her children's hunger was stronger. She accepted the food. Margaret looked at the stove, nearly finished now, whitewashed and massive and waiting. "I still think you're crazy," she said, "but I hope it works. I truly do." That night, Anna built a small fire of dry grass in the firebox, not enough to stress the clay, just enough to warm it gently, to begin the curing process. She watched the smoke rise through the channels, following the path her grandmother had taught her, the path that extracted heat from fire and stored it in stone. The clay walls warmed, slowly, barely, but they warmed. On November 8th, the first snow fell. 1 inch of white, light as feathers, covering the prairie like a shroud. The stove was finished. The cure had begun. And somewhere to the northwest, above the Alberta border, a mass of Arctic air was building. The coldest air to descend on the American plains in 40 years. Anna did not know this. She knew only that winter had arrived, that her stove was not yet proven, and that every night her children shivered under thin blankets while she waited for the clay to dry. On November 14th, she built a full fire for the first time, 40 pounds of twisted slough grass packed into the firebox. The match caught. The flames roared, hot and fast and over in 20 minutes. Anna's heart sank. It seemed wrong. The fire should last longer. The heat should. She placed her hand on the clay wall, warmth rising, spreading. By noon, the entire mass radiated heat. The temperature inside the shanty climbed from 40 degrees to 55. The children stopped shivering. Peter's cough seemed to ease in the warmth. "Mama," Katerina said, wonder in her voice. "It's like summer." Anna allowed herself a moment of hope. One moment. Then she remembered what John Henderson had said when he first saw the stove working. "You haven't seen a real Dakota blizzard yet. This is early winter. Wait until January." January was coming, and with it, the test that would prove whether Anna Albrecht's grandmother had given her salvation or a beautiful way to die. December came to the Dakota prairie like a slow-closing fist. The temperature dropped 10 degrees, then 20. By the second week, Anna was firing the stove twice daily, once at dawn, once at dusk, and the massive clay structure was proving itself in ways she had not dared to hope. Outside, 15 degrees below zero. Inside, 58 degrees. The stove consumed approximately 100 pounds of twisted grass per day. Anna had stockpiled nearly 2,000 pounds inside the shanty, stacked against the walls, under the beds, in every corner where it would stay dry. Enough for 20 days. If she could reach the slough where the tall grass grew, she could gather more. If she could not, if a blizzard trapped her inside, she would have to ration. John Henderson visited on December 10th, his breath crystallizing in the air as he stepped through Anna's door. He stood before the stove for a long time, saying nothing. Then he placed his palm against the whitewashed clay. His eyebrows rose. "I'll be damned," he said. "It actually works." Anna allowed herself a small nod. "It works." "What's the temperature in here?" 55. 58 when I fire it fresh." Henderson walked a slow circle around the structure, studying the construction, the channels he could see through the firebox opening, the way the heat radiated evenly from every surface. His expression was unreadable. "You haven't seen a real Dakota blizzard yet," he said finally. "This is early winter. 15 below is nothing. Wait until it drops to 30, 40. Wait until the wind comes and you can't see your hand in front of your face for 3 days straight." "I know." "What happens when you can't get outside to gather fuel?" Anna gestured at the stacked grass. "I have enough inside. 20 days. "And if the blizzard lasts longer?" "It will not." Henderson looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not belief exactly, but something adjacent to it. Reluctant respect, perhaps. "I hope you're right," he said. "I truly do." After he left, Anna stood by the stove and listened to the wind outside. Henderson's doubt was honest. He had survived 10 Dakota winters. He had buried a daughter. He knew things about cold that Anna was only beginning to learn, but he did not know about thermal mass. He did not know about the channels that extracted heat from smoke. He did not know that her grandmother's stove had stood for 55 years in weather as brutal as anything Dakota could offer. The stove knew, and the stove would prove it. Christmas came quietly. Anna traded 3 days of labor for the Hendersons, mending clothes, helping with livestock, in exchange for a small ham and a sack of flour. She made dumplings the way her mother had made them, and the children ate until their bellies rounded, and for one evening the shanty felt like a home instead of a survival shelter. Margaret Henderson had sent a note with the flour. "Come visit in spring. I want to learn about your stove." It was the first time anyone had expressed interest in learning rather than doubting. Anna tucked the note into her Bible and allowed herself to imagine spring, green grass, warm sun, her children playing outside without coats. First, she had to survive January. The 10th day of January, 1888, arrived like a gift from God. Anna woke to warmth, not the warmth of the stove, though that was there, steady as always, but the warmth of air, outside air. She opened the door and felt something impossible, a breeze from the south, soft and mild, carrying the smell of distant rain. The temperature was above freezing. After weeks of brutal cold, the prairie had thawed. Katerina begged to play outside. Peter's cough had improved in the weeks of steady warmth, and he wanted to run. Even Maria, usually content to stay near the stove, pulled at Anna's skirt and pointed toward the door. Anna let them go. She hung laundry on the line. The first time in weeks it would dry instead of freeze. She walked to the slough and gathered armloads of tall grass, adding to her stockpile. The sun was bright. The sky was clear. The old-timers in Freeman would later say the weather felt like April, not January. What Anna did not know, what no one on the Dakota Prairie knew, was that a massive wall of Arctic air had dropped out of Alberta the night before. It was racing southeast across Montana at 50 miles per hour, a cold front so violent and so fast that it would reach South Dakota by noon. At 11 in the morning on January 12th, the children were playing in the melting snow 50 yards from the shanty. At 11:15, Anna looked up from her work and saw the western horizon turn strange. The sky was no longer blue. A wall of white and gray was rising from the edge of the world, churning and boiling, swallowing the sun as it came. The wind shifted. She felt it physically, a violent pivot from south to northwest, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in the time it took her to draw breath. "Katerina!" Anna screamed. "Peter! Maria!" The wind took her voice and scattered it. The children couldn't hear her. They were dots of color against the white grass, oblivious, still playing. Anna ran. The snow began before she reached them, not falling but driving, horizontal, blinding. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees, another 5. By the time she grabbed Katerina's hand, she could barely see her own feet. "Where's Maria?" she shouted. "Where's your sister?" Katerina's face was white with terror. She was right here. She was. Gone. The 4-year-old had vanished into a wall of white nothing. Anna made a decision that would either save her daughter or kill them all. She grabbed a length of rope from the pile near the shanty door. She had left it there for exactly this purpose, though she had prayed she would never need it, and tied one end to the door handle. The other end she wrapped around her waist. "Stay here," she told Katerina and Peter. "Do not move. Do not let go of the door." Then she walked into the white void. The wind screamed. The snow drove into her eyes, her nose, her mouth, until she could not breathe without swallowing ice. Visibility was 0. She could not see her own hand at the end of her arm. She counted her steps. 5, 10, 15. The rope unspooled behind her, her only connection to the shanty, to her other children, to survival. At 20 yards, she heard crying. Maria was huddled in a shallow depression in the snow, already shaking, already blue around the lips. Anna grabbed her, pulled her close, and turned back toward the shanty. But which way was back? The world was white in every direction. The rope in her hands was the only truth. She followed it, hand over hand, step by step, the wind shoving her sideways, the cold biting through her clothes. The shanty appeared like a ghost, a dark shape in the whiteness. And Anna stumbled through the door with Maria in her arms, Katerina and Peter tumbling in behind her. She slammed the door, barred it with the wooden beam she had installed for exactly this moment. Outside, the world disappeared. Inside, the stove radiated heat. The first 6 hours were survivable. Anna fired the stove with 40 pounds of twisted grass. The flames roared hot and fast, the way they always did, and the massive clay structure began absorbing the heat. The temperature inside the shanty climbed to 58 degrees, while outside the wind screamed at 50 miles per hour, and the thermometer, if she had been able to see it, would have read 14 degrees below zero. Maria was hypothermic. Her skin was gray, her shivering violent, her eyes unfocused. Anna stripped off the child's wet clothes and wrapped her in every dry blanket, then placed her on the warm clay floor near the stove. Slowly, over the course of an hour, the color returned to Maria's cheeks. The shivering eased. She slept. But Peter's cough had returned. The cold air he had breathed during the run to the shanty had aggravated his lungs. By evening, his breathing was labored. By midnight, he was burning with fever. Anna knew what this meant. She had seen pneumonia take children in Ukraine. The disease crept into the chest and settled there, filling the lungs with fluid, drowning its victims from the inside. Peter needed warmth, consistent, reliable warmth, or the sickness would kill him before the storm passed. A conventional iron stove would require feeding every 2 to 3 hours. She would have to wake through the night, hauling fuel, keeping the fire alive, never sleeping more than 90 minutes at a stretch. Her Russian stove held heat, but she still needed to fire it at midnight and again at 4 in the morning to maintain the temperature Peter required. Anna did not sleep that first night. At 6 in the evening, she built the first regular fire. Inside temperature, 58 degrees. At 9, the stove was still radiating. Temperature, 52 degrees. The wind had not diminished. She could hear it clawing at the tar paper walls, finding gaps, forcing cold fingers through every crack. She stuffed rags into the gaps, hung blankets over the single window, created a smaller heated space around the stove where the temperature held steady. At midnight, she built the second fire. Temperature had dropped to 48 degrees. Peter's fever was rising. Anna wrapped him in the wool blanket Margaret Henderson had given her and placed him on the warm clay floor beside Maria. His forehead burned against her hand. His chest rattled with every breath. "Mama," he whispered, "I'm cold." "I know, little one. The stove will keep you warm." She did not tell him she was terrified. She did not tell him she had counted the twisted grass and calculated that she had 16 days of fuel if the storm lasted 3 days, 12 days if it lasted 4, and if it lasted longer than that. She did not think about what happened if it lasted longer than that. At 4 in the morning, she built the third fire. Temperature, 45 degrees, the lowest it had dropped. Peter's fever had not broken, but it had not climbed higher. He was sleeping, his breath ragged but steady. Anna allowed herself to sit against the warm clay wall of the stove, just for a moment, just to rest her eyes. She woke to gray light filtering through the snow-crusted window. The storm was still raging. January 13th, the second day. Anna fired the stove at 8 in the morning. The temperature outside had dropped to 32 degrees below zero. She learned this later from the records kept at Huron. The wind had not diminished. The snow continued to drive sideways, piling into drifts that climbed the walls of the shanty. Inside, the temperature was 51 degrees. Peter's fever spiked that morning to 103 degrees. He was delirious, calling out for his father, for his grandmother, for people who were dead or an ocean away. Anna boiled snow for water and made him drink, small sips, again and again, while the stove radiated its gentle, constant heat. Katerina was silent. She sat in the corner with Maria, watching her mother, watching her brother, understanding more than a 9-year-old should have to understand. "Will Peter die?" she asked. Anna looked at her daughter. The truth was that she did not know. The truth was that if they were in an American homestead with an American iron stove, Peter would almost certainly die. The stove would go cold, the temperature would drop, and the pneumonia would take him. But they were not in an American homestead. "The stove will keep him warm," Anna said, "and the warmth will help him fight." At 2 in the afternoon, she built the 5th fire. Temperature had stabilized at 48 degrees. Peter's fever held at 102, not better, but not worse. At 10 in the evening, the 6th fire. The stack of twisted grass against the wall was noticeably smaller. Anna tried not to look at it. At 4 in the morning of January 14th, she built the 7th fire. Peter's fever had broken. He was sleeping normally, his forehead cool, his breathing easier. Anna allowed herself to cry. Outside, the storm continued, but the wind was dying. The howl had faded to a moan. The snow was still falling, but it fell now instead of driving sideways. By noon, the sky began to lighten. By 6 in the evening, the storm was over. Anna opened the door to a world transformed. The snow had drifted 6 feet high against the north wall of the shanty. The prairie was a sea of white, unmarked, featureless, stretching to every horizon. The temperature was still 20 degrees below zero, but the sun was out. The crisis was passing. Inside, the stove radiated steady warmth. The clay walls were warm to the touch. The floor near the firebox was warm enough to sit on. Anna had burned 200 pounds of twisted grass over 3 days. Her stove had never gone cold. The internal temperature had never dropped below 45 degrees. She thought about John Henderson, 3/4 of a mile away, with his iron cook stove and his 12 cords of wood. She would learn later what had happened there. The rescue party reached the Albrecht homestead at noon on January 15th. They were the same men who had found the frozen Norwegian woman the day before, the same men who had cataloged the dead and the dying across Turner County. They expected to find another tragedy. Instead, they found warm air and cooking food and children playing on a floor heated by clay. The leader of the party, a man named Erickson who had lost 2 fingers to frostbite in the blizzard of '83, stood in the doorway of the shanty and stared at the whitewashed stove as if it were a miracle. "How?" he said. Anna did not understand the English word. "How?" he repeated, gesturing at the stove, at the warm walls, at the children who should have been dead. "How did you do this?" Anna placed her hand on the clay surface. "My grandmother," she said. "She taught me." Erickson knelt and touched the floor near the stove. His face, weathered by 40 Dakota winters, showed something Anna had never seen from an American stranger. Respect. "Ma'am," he said, "I've lived on this prairie most of my life. I've never seen anything like this." The Henderson homestead had nearly become a grave. John Henderson's iron cook stove went cold 12 hours into the blizzard. The wood he had stockpiled, 12 cords, more than any neighbor for miles, was buried under 6-foot drifts. He could not reach it. The family burned furniture first. 3 chairs, their grandmother's rocking chair, the table where they ate their meals. When the furniture was gone, they burned the wooden floor, ripping up planks, feeding them to the iron maw of the stove, buying a few more hours of survivable heat. Margaret Henderson suffered frostbite on 3 fingers of her left hand. Their oldest son, Thomas, age 16, developed hypothermia so severe that his pulse dropped to 30 beats per minute. He survived, but barely. The inside temperature of the Henderson home dropped to 28 degrees at its worst. 4 degrees below freezing, they lost 2 pigs and a milk cow that froze in the barn. The Hendersons survived, but they survived by burning their home. Across Turner County, others were not so fortunate. 3 people died in the children's blizzard of January 1888. An elderly man who tried to reach his barn and never made it, and the Norwegian mother and child whose bodies the rescue party had found on the morning of January 15th. The mother's name was Ingrid Olmsted. She was 31 years old. She had gone outside during a brief lull in the storm to gather buffalo chips from the pile near the barn. The lull ended while she was 10 yards from her door. Her husband found her body the next morning, still clutching the fuel that couldn't save her. Her iron stove had gone cold 6 hours after she died. John Henderson came to Anna's homestead 3 days after the blizzard ended. He arrived on foot, his horse too weak to carry him, his face raw from frostbite that was already starting to peel. Margaret was with him, her bandaged hand tucked against her chest. They stood in Anna's shanty, surrounded by warmth, and said nothing for a long time. Henderson was the first to speak. "I've been on this prairie for 10 years, he said. His voice was hoarse. From the cold or from something else. Lost a daughter to cold in 81. Thought I knew everything there was to know about surviving winter." He paused. His eyes moved to the stove, to the thick clay walls, to the channels visible through the firebox opening. "I was wrong." Anna waited. "This," Henderson said, placing his hand on the warm surface, "is better than anything I've ever seen. You could have taught us all something, if we'd listened." "My grandmother taught me," Anna said. "Her grandmother taught her. It is old knowledge." "Old knowledge?" Henderson repeated the words as if testing them. "We burned our floor, Mrs. Albrecht, our table, our chairs, Margaret's fingers." He stopped, his jaw tightening. "And you burned grass, just grass." "The stove holds the heat, the iron does not." Margaret stepped forward. Her eyes were wet. "Can you teach me?" she asked. "Can you show me how to build one?" Anna looked at her. 3 months ago, this woman had called her crazy, had said the stove would never work, had offered her barn as shelter when the foreign contraption failed. Now she was asking to learn. "Yes," Anna said. "I will teach you." Word spread across Turner County like fire across dry grass. By late January, Anna had visitors every week, farmers, their wives, men who had laughed at the German widow's mud oven and now came with questions and notebooks and the humbled expressions of people who have watched their certainties burn with their furniture. Deputy Land Agent Charles Whitmore arrived in February. He said nothing as he walked through the shanty, examining the stove, the clay floor Anna had laid in December, the children who were healthy and whole and alive. He took notes in his small book, his face unreadable. When he finished, he stood in the doorway and looked at Anna. "Improvements adequate," he said. "Claim valid." He did not apologize for what he had said in October. He did not acknowledge that he had called her stove savage and her survival doubtful. But he filed his report with the General Land Office, and the report said what it needed to say. Anna Albrecht's homestead was approved. The spring of 1888 brought Heinrich Schrag from Freeman with a work party of 6 Mennonite men. They built Russian stoves for 3 American families in Turner County. The Hendersons were first. John Henderson traded 2 pigs and his labor for the materials, and worked alongside the Mennonites for 2 weeks while the massive clay structure rose in the center of his home. When it was finished, he stood before it with the expression of a man who has seen the future. "If we'd had this last January," he said, "I wouldn't have burned my grandmother's rocking chair." By summer, 6 more masonry heaters were under construction across the county. The Freeman Mennonites began teaching brickmaking workshops to anyone who wanted to learn. The techniques spread through church networks, through agricultural societies, through the simple mechanism of neighbors talking to neighbors. The core innovation, thermal mass heating with fast-burning fuel, had crossed the barrier between immigrant superstition and American common sense. It had taken a blizzard that killed hundreds and a widow who refused to listen. Anna Albrecht never became rich. She proved up her homestead in 1892, 5 years after she filed the claim, and received the deed to 160 acres of Dakota Prairie. In 1895, she married a German-Russian farmer named Karl Neufeld, a widower with 2 children of his own. They had 2 more children together. Her original Russian stove stood and functioned for over 40 years. when it was finally replaced by a modern oil furnace in 1931. The family saved one of the original Batsa bricks. It sat on the mantelpiece of the new house, a reminder of what their grandmother had built with her hands. Anna died in 1934 at the age of 79. She was buried in Salem Zion Mennonite Cemetery in Turner County, South Dakota. Her gravestone bears her name, her dates, and a single line in German. Sie wusste, wie man warm bleibt. She knew how to stay warm. By 1900, an estimated 15 to 20% of homesteads in the German-Russian triangle of South Dakota had masonry heaters. The technology persisted longest in Mennonite and Hutterite communities, where traditional knowledge passed from generation to generation without the need for agricultural bulletins or university extension programs. Some of the original stoves built in the 1880s and 90s remained in use until the 1950s. They outlasted the homesteaders who built them, the blizzards that tested them, the century that dismissed them. Rural electrification came to the Dakota Prairie in the 1930s and 40s. Oil heating followed. By 1960, the Russian stove had become a curiosity, something grandparents mentioned, something historians cataloged, something that belonged to an era when survival was not guaranteed. The knowledge that Anna Albrecht carried across the Atlantic, the knowledge that kept her children alive when the temperature dropped to 40 below, faded into memory. But memory has a way of returning. The energy crisis of the 1970s sparked renewed interest in efficient heating. Researchers rediscovered what German-Russian immigrants had known for a century, that thermal mass heating was among the most efficient methods ever devised. Finnish and Swedish and Austrian designs entered the American market, each one built on the same principles Anna's grandmother had understood. Today, the Masonry Heater Association of North America promotes technology that would be instantly recognizable to a Mennonite settler from 1887. The specifications have been refined. The materials have improved, but the core insight remains unchanged. Capture the heat of a fast fire in heavy mass and release it slowly over hours. The Heritage Hall Museum in Freeman, South Dakota, preserves German-Russian heating technology and exhibits that draw visitors from across the country. The Welk Homestead State Historic Site, near Strasburg, North Dakota, birthplace of Lawrence Welk, features original Batsa brick construction. The past is not quite dead. The same land Anna Albrecht homesteaded still exists. The tar paper shanty is long gone, replaced by generations of buildings that have come and gone with the fortunes of prairie agriculture. The claim changed hands a dozen times in the century after Anna's death. But if you know where to look, if you walk the fence line of what was once the Albrecht homestead and find the slight depression near the old creek bank, you can see something. A rectangle of old brick half buried in prairie soil, 4 feet by 6 feet, the footprint of a stove. The farmers who work this land walk past it without knowing what it is. To them, it is debris, an artifact, something left behind by people whose names they have never learned. But on cold January nights when the wind comes down from Alberta and the temperature drops toward 40 below, something of Anna Albrecht's knowledge remains in the land she saved her children on. The lesson of the Russian stove is simple, and it is not about stoves. Sometimes the best solutions are not invented, they are inherited. Sometimes the people with the fewest resources have the most knowledge. Sometimes the future looks a lot like the past, and the experts are wrong, and the widow with $47 and no English and a design everyone calls foreign superstition is the one who survives. Anna Albrecht never became famous. She never wrote a book or gave a lecture or received recognition from the agricultural societies that later studied her methods. She was a woman who lost her husband on the way to a new country and arrived with nothing but her children and her memory and her hands. She built a stove. She burned grass. She kept her children alive when the cold came to kill them. And when the neighbors found her floor warm at 40 below, she taught them everything she knew. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.